Well, hello, everyone. This is Flip Pideaux again from Open Model Project. I'm here once again with Peter Herford. This is our first podcast episode as a standalone podcast approved in the App Store, so thank you for finding us. And while you're here, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, offer us a rating and review if you're so moved. It does help us increase the visibility of the show and get your friends and family on board. It's been about a week since our first outing, our first podcast episode on the eve of the Georgia Senate runoffs. And while the news cycle has led to it feeling like about 100 years have passed since then, we are here to do a bit of a postmortem on Georgia amidst the environment of us all descending into the worst version of dysfunctional DC fan fiction. But we're gonna offer you a little bit of a respite from that today and get back into some of the Georgia numbers. As you know, if you've been following us at openmodelproject.org, we had done both a poll of Georgia voters in advance of those races, those Senate races, and a forecast largely built on Peter's own work modeling those races, those notoriously hard to model runoff races. And so we want to see kind of where the forecast worked, where it didn't. Off the bat, fair to say that not all that much worked in terms of actually nailing the numbers. But, as we said before Georgia, the point of this exercise was not necessarily to put together the perfect probabilistic forecast of these elections, but more of a way to, in public, in the full light of day, to demonstrate this framework that we're building for more of an ongoing collaboration, a collaborative evolution of an open source, totally transparent election forecasting platform and polling platform. And again, just to remind those that may not be that familiar with what we're up to here, so the overall purpose of the Open Model Project is to combine some semblance of crowd wisdom and our ethos of kind of radical transparency with traditional election modeling techniques and opinion polling. Our thesis being that decentralized and diverse views, public input, inviting as much scrutiny and experimentation and suggestions from the public in our growing community of builders may pave the way to better, more reliable, more accountable election forecasting. So, with Georgia in the books, let's look at where these initial best guess methods and model weights succeeded and failed, set the stage for some improvements, see if any tweaks that we could have made before Georgia would have moved us closer to the right results, and see if those tweaks are instructive for some of the upcoming interesting elections later in this 2021 off-cycle year. I want to note again that this race, these twin Georgia Senate runoffs were super hard to model and to poll. And of course, many of your household name forecasters didn't even bother trying. So we certainly tip our hats to those others who did. We're going to talk a little bit about those other forecasts and what they may have been onto or off from in terms of their relative performance. So with that as prologue, I want to go to Peter. And can you give us just a little bit of a recap on the eve of, or really the morning of, was our final adjustment of the forecast, what our polling and what our forecast suggested was going to be the outcome of those two races?
Yeah, so thanks, Flip. Our poll had, as you may know, had both Republicans winning by 4 points. We did have a pretty large margin of error of 4 points on that number, but obviously it wasn't even remotely close to 4 points, so that was not a strong showing for our poll. Happy to dive into that. Our forecast, our final forecast, we gave 56% chance of Warnock winning, and he did win, and a 50-50 chance of Ossoff winning, and he did win. And then our Democratic Senate odds was at 47%, so like the slightest of tilts to Republicans, and that's just because Democrats have to win both those races to capture the Senate, and they did, but it was very toss-up-y, definitely toss-up range. We felt like it could go either way, and it definitely did. But I think compared to other models, we may have been the most Republican-leaning model, so insofar as we stack up to other people, not the best showing, so happy to talk more about that.
Yeah, and so and thank you for that breakdown. And let's kind of take this on two different tracks here, since we had these two components. The polling that you orchestrated, what was it, about a week and a half? I think the polling period was about a week, but I think it was December 22nd to the 27th was the the polling period.
That's right. Yeah.
And the second part being the model that used not only polling data, adjusted polling data, but also prediction market data and some other adjustments and experimental factors that people were able to play with. But so we've got the two pieces, the poll and the forecast. And our forecast, of course, discounted our own polling and lumped it in with all the other polls to try and kind of triangulate a better prediction. But let's start on the polling side, which, as you mentioned, was the further off of the two. We had both Republicans winning by 4. As you said, it was the most Republican-leaning poll in the field. And again, for folks who haven't played with these things on our website, I'd urge you, if you're somewhere you can do so, to open up a browser and go to openmodelproject.org. You can access the Poll Explorer. One of the really cool features is that we make all of the different weights, the likely voter screening factors, things like that, all the basically subjective assumptions that pollsters use in making their predictions and setting their polling margins, available to you, the user, to see what our assumptions are, but then to actually change, if you like, turn on and off the likely voter screen, or change the weights in it, or change the way that we're weighting the demographics based on census or exit polls and things like that. So the first thing I'd like to do is, since we were so far off, so we said +4 on both Republicans, whereas it turned out about +1 on the Ossoff race for the Democrats and closer to +2, I think, on the Warnock race. So we were off by 5 in one and 6 in the other. Jumping back in there to the Poll Explorer, are there some of these toggles or sliders that we can look at, different assumptions we might have used that gives us a result that would have been closer, and that's still kind of a reasonable assumption? We don't want to overfit, or kind of hack the results to get to it in kind of an artificial way. But are there some kind of reasonable alternate assumptions that would have given us a better look at what was actually going to happen?
Yeah, definitely. So I definitely do want to make clear that, as I said in the previous episode, there's nothing about polling where you just ask a bunch of people and then tally up what they say and that's your result. There's all these assumptions that are going in, and really the reason why polls are wrong are often from incorrect assumptions. So that's one thing we really wanted to do with our kind of radical transparency pledge, was show you all the assumptions we're making and also show you how the results change if we make different assumptions. And so I'll kind of walk you through a little bit about what we do. Is we tried to collect people from online surveys and from calling landlines. And we did that because those are the two cheapest methods to get respondents, and we're not really that wealthy here yet at the Open Model Project. So a lot of my research that I've been doing has been about how to kind of get accurate results from these more inexpensive methods of survey collection, and really try to stack up against the big guns. And I have been successful at that in other polls for the general election and for some state polling in California. But this poll was definitely my biggest miss, and I guess the odds are it was going to happen eventually. I think the big thing that I kind of did not do as great of a job on is that likely voter model. So basically the way this poll works is it goes through 2 phases. After you collect all the data from the online survey and the landline phone calls, the first step is to adjust your respondents to make them match the actual demographics you're expecting. So we definitely oversampled older people because older people are more likely to have those landline phones. We also oversampled Biden voters. That's a pretty common thing where Republicans are just less likely to answer polls. But we try to adjust for those things with our demographic weighting. And if you don't do any demographic weighting at all, you just get very ludicrous results. I'm on our Poll Explorer and I turn off all the weighting and it just gets you Warnock winning by 15 points. And that's obviously ridiculous. So that's kind of why we really need to be weighting the data. And that's why every single pollster that has ever run and published a poll does this online weighting. The next step, though, is that likely voter model, because when you adjust for everything, you're not necessarily getting people that are going to vote. So we try to screen people by whether they voted in the 2020 general election and whether they said they're going to vote or not. We were using an abridged version of the Perry-Gallup index, which was developed by Gallup polling, where they score people probabilistically using historical data, and to like kind of gauge a likelihood of voting and adjusting your sample that way. A lot of pollsters don't use probabilistic models. I really think they should, but I guess that's a separate digression. But the point is, I think here our demographic weighting was very good. I think like a lot of our crosstabs matched pretty well what actually happened, but our likely voter model really messed up. And if you go to our website, you flip off that likely voter model, and now you get both Democrats winning by 2.5 points, which is actually really close to what happened. So we would have been, I think, one of the most accurate polls in the entire cycle if only we had not messed up that likely voter model. I mean, of course, I don't think you should give us credit for that because, I mean, we made the decisions we did. And also the margin of error is pretty wide here. But I think our error really came almost entirely down to that likely voter model. And I guess some reasons why is that I think the likely voter model we used was a bit too abridged. We kind of tried to do it in just 2 simple questions, where the full model uses 7 questions. So maybe we should have used some of the others. I guess like we were trying to save space on our poll, but I guess the index is long for a reason. So learned that the hard way. I think another thing is we did not sufficiently penalize people that didn't turn out in 2020. So we had a lot of Republican-leaning voters who did not vote for Trump or Biden or anyone, but they said they were super enthusiastic about the runoff, and they said they were very likely to vote. And so we gave them a like small penalty, but I think if we had used a mid-sized or large penalty, our results would have found a very close, like Ossoff, Warnock winning by 0.5 point each race.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's interesting. This is one thing that I kind of stumble onto too, just sort of playing around with the sliders on the Poll Explorer. That if you and these are kind of cool. If you go to the site, you can see you can put them wherever you want. It's anywhere from 0 to 2, basically, on how they answered these couple of questions. If they turned out in 2020, and how if they already voted, and how likely they are to vote. Very likely, somewhat likely, or not likely. And we had, as you said, a small penalty depending on if you turned out in 2020. We had that at a 0.5, whereas we had very likely to vote at the same level, about 0.5, but already voted, you got a 1. So that was kind of the heaviest weight. And if you bump that you turned out, double that weight from 0.5 to 1, and take the very likely to vote, which was 1, take that down to 1/2, basically switch those two. So in other words, discount the fact that a respondent says, yeah, I'm really likely to vote, I really want to vote, and give them much more credit if they actually turned out in 2020, then we have both Democrats winning by a small margin, rather than the Republicans winning by a fairly healthy margin. So that change alone might get you most of the way there. Hard to necessarily map that to every election, but maybe it's instructive here, at least for the samples we're gathering with our methods, that a much better way to screen is by looking at your turnout history, not how excited you say you are to vote.
Yeah, and I think different pollsters have found different things, and it may honestly vary state by state. I think like some pollsters, such as Ann Selzer, who's a very famous pollster in Iowa, really heavily weights that like what people say is what they're going to do. And she does have a point. Like we find time and time again that voters tend not to lie on surveys. There's no like Trump voters lying about voting for Biden. People tend not to lie very much. And you can like actually buy a voter file and see, you can't see who people voted for, but you can see whether they voted or not. So we can actually, we can't do this with our poll, but other pollsters who poll from voter files can actually go and verify whether people said they're going to vote if they actually vote. And they can like verify other things like what people say about their race and their age and their gender and things. And it seems like people lie rather infrequently. But one thing that people actually do sometimes lie about is people do greatly exaggerate the likelihood of them voting. But they also tend to exaggerate the likelihood of them not voting. So I think we find that like 10% of people who say they're like basically guaranteed not to vote actually do vote, but only like 85% of people who say they're guaranteed to vote do vote. And that's data from Gallup. So we did try to adjust for that, but like when we ran our survey, basically everyone said they were extremely likely to vote, so it ended up being kind of
Yeah,
hard
and maybe
to
that's
screen
not
on.
not surprising given the high stakes and high kind of emotional fervor going into this election. You might get almost everyone saying they're very likely to, so screening by that maybe is less instructive, and so maybe that's not a lesson that always will carry over as kind of a general heuristic. But I wonder, and you mentioned some pollsters actually match their respondents against voter files. You can see who actually did vote. Going forward, would that be something for us to consider? I don't know how much more expensive or time consuming it is, but in other words, if you just don't do a likely voter screen, if you simply say, look, to qualify for the poll, we're going to strip out anyone who didn't vote in, say, 2 of the 3 last even year elections or something like that. I mean, is that a plausible alternative?
Yeah, so I'd say a couple of things on that. I think it's definitely good that we did do some screening on whether people turned out, because I mean, if Trump Biden's the highest stakes election in our era and people aren't turning out for that, like you wonder why they're actually going to start doing this runoff thing all of a sudden. So maybe we should have penalized that. But like I would be very careful against applying like extremely high turnout penalties. I think some reasons are that like sometimes people aren't old enough to have voted in past elections, so you want to be very careful to look at your age requirements. And sometimes like younger people don't vote, but then they start voting when they're older. So there's definitely a strong age effect there, and like a lot of these likely voter models can end up penalizing millennial voters that actually do start turning out in droves sometimes.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah,
yeah.
and I guess you can get the opposite effect going the other way too, right? If you have a super high stakes election and then if you wind up in a kind of a more humdrum midterm,
Yeah.
and you're giving, huge weight and almost exclusively to whether you voted in the previous super high stakes election, then you're not really filtering in much of a meaningful way either, right? Because you're capturing basically everyone from a record turnout election.
Yeah, and then I think another thing I would say is a lot of these polls, they just they take people who they think are likely to vote and they survey them, and then the people they think are unlikely to vote, they completely drop from their survey. And like virtually every pollster does that, but I think that's a really bad idea because like still these people they're dropping, like 10% of them are still actually voting, and that could be pretty significant. So we do what's called a probabilistic likely voter model, where instead of dropping these unlikely voters, we just apply a penalty where we only count their vote 10% as much as everyone else. And so that way we're still getting their kind of like likelihood of vote adjusted opinion. So if maybe those low turnout voters are skewing heavily towards Republicans or something, it still might matter. And that may be one of the reasons why Biden was overestimated in the general election, was all these low turnout, non-college educated white voters that Trump brings in droves. But then I guess they didn't show up at the runoff. And
right.
Yeah.
So one other question about the polling, and then we'll turn over to the forecast. We used, as you alluded to earlier, 2 different samples through 2 different methods, online and IVR to landline phone calls. Did you find that one sample versus the other, and I know we ran slightly different screens because there were slightly different demographic compositions to the respondent pools in those 2, but did you find that if we had discarded one and only used the other, would that have influenced the top line results?
Yeah, I think both of them are pretty interesting in their own right. The online survey is very heavily skewed towards younger, more urban, more liberal people. If we had used only that, we would have gotten an Ossoff Warnock result for sure, maybe winning by 3 or 4 points. And I think that would have been judged pretty favorably. Whereas if we had used only the landline polling, so like really only old people have landlines these days, and half the people on our landline survey were over 65. And if we had used only the landline, we would have gotten this like a more conservative result. I think maybe like +2 for both candidates. And it was really kind of the blending and the likely voter model. Again, the likely voter model is really what threw a lot of it off, not necessarily like our choice of mixing online surveys and landline surveys.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
One other note I want to make in defense of our polling, off as it was, is that, again, it was taken a week, or in some cases, week and a half before the election. And, of course, a couple significant things happened over the course of that week. You did see the poll averages move a couple points towards the Democrats in that final week. So from possibly, slight tilt Republican to basically toss up to tilt Democrat, which is kind of how it came out, 1 to 2 points for the Democrats. And that was, you saw the $2,000 checks, COVID stimulus checks dry up, which the Republicans took the blame for in Congress. And then you also had, of course, the entree of Missouri Senator Josh Hawley for the first time avowing publicly that he would side with the some of the House Republicans in objecting to the election results. And that did seem to, it's tough to exactly map the causal relationship there, but that did seem to track with not huge, but a sudden and noticeable degradation in the polling for GOP prospects. So I think it's very possible if we had done our polling a week later, like right up to the eve of the election, we might have been, who knows what, maybe 2 points closer. So, I don't think necessarily the full 5 to 6 points we can chalk up to polling error. And I say that not to sort of excuse the error, but again, the whole point of this is trying to iterate and make this better and learn lessons to make this more accurate going forward. And so, a really big risk is trying to overfit the prior results to the prior forecast and say, okay, we need to find a way to massage this and kind of shove it through and torture these toggles until everything shows the exact right number. And I think you can overdo that, obviously, especially if there was something in those last few days that caused a bit of a shift that was later than our survey could have captured.
Yeah, I guess I would just say 3 quick things on that. I think one, like from looking at the polls, what you said, there did seem to be a genuine 1 to 2 point shift in those last 2 weeks. I think also the Trump, like the literal day before the election, it was revealed that Trump had tried to strong arm the Georgia Secretary of State as well. And, so there was a lot of late movement from our poll. I think 2 is our poll does have this pretty wide margin of error. Our sample size isn't big, and the polling is pretty heavily weighted, and a lot of the assumptions, if they had just gone slightly differently, as I mentioned, so that does do a little bit of error. And I think the other thing that I do want to say is that when we had this result and we saw it was both Republicans +4, I don't think anyone on our staff actually believed the actual outcome was going to be +4. And I think a lot of other pollsters, when they see an outcome like +4, they throw it away and readjust their model until it gets a result that they think is more reasonable. This is a process called herding, where pollsters deliberately skew their numbers to match the consensus of other pollsters, because no one kind of wants to be seen as the odd one out. And polling is considered a bad thing. It makes the election forecast harder when you have less accurate data, and it can lead to more systematic errors in polling. And so we kind of have a no herding pledge here at Open Model Project. And so when we thought that our best assumptions were leading to +4, we were okay, let's just publish the +4. And if Republicans win in a landslide, I guess we'll look like geniuses.
Right.
But
and if not, we'll own it and try and dissect why it was wrong, where it was wrong. And again, that's so central to the point here. And I'm glad you brought that up in the herding, because there's so much polling done, obviously, for nationwide races on down to municipal races. And it gives a false sense of, well, gosh, I mean, they poll thousands of people and there's hundreds of polls. And then you get these sophisticated forecasts that, we simulated 40,000 election outcomes. Gosh, with this many numbers being thrown at it, how could it be that far off? But things like that herding that you mentioned, it doesn't necessarily mean you don't have to believe in a conspiracy of one ideology or another taking over the nationwide polling apparatus and trying to convince you of something that's not true. But like you said, a pollster that puts out a really wrong forecast is going to look silly. So they have an interest in not looking silly, not because they support necessarily one candidate or one party, but if they're getting a result that seems way off, and they can't find a reason why it's off. Oh yeah, gosh, I had an arithmetic error here, or there's some screener error that I entered something wrong, or I want to kind of rethink the logic here. If they can't find any fundamental or kind of philosophical reason why they're getting the bad result, but it's simply an outlier, they're still going to have an incentive to. And even in this Georgia cycle, there was at least one or two rumored polls that showed like a +6, +7 on the Democrat side, and they were spiked because they didn't want to look silly. I don't know if that's true or not, but certainly this herding incentive is out there. And whether it just simply means, okay, that poll is way too far off, I don't believe it. I don't know why I don't believe it, because the methodology looks right, but I can't put this out. I've got to rerun it. Okay, now this looks a little better. I'll put this one out. And so that does then, obviously, you can see how that can lead to this herding effect where whatever is the current consensus will be sort of self-reinforcing as the consensus. And so now you get the hundreds of polls and the tens of thousands of simulations from a dozen different forecasters, but they're all taking in the same garbage. And if it's all the same garbage in, it's all the same garbage out. You can simulate it 1 billion times. You'll get the same, result based on flawed data. And so, as you put quite eloquently, that's sort of central to what we're doing here. We got this +4 on there, and we went back and forth, for a couple of days working on this. Why are we seeing +4? Let's adjust this. Let's go back and forth. Does this make sense the way we're doing this? Because this result is a little bit of an outlier. And we in the end determined that no, our sort of best estimate, best judgment of the proper weights and the proper assumptions to feed into the raw poll numbers outputted this result. So that's the result that we went with. And, we were happy to, as you said, look brilliant if it was right, and to take our lumps and revisit it, in a quite clinical and dispassionate way if it turned out to be off, which is what we're doing here now.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's move from the polling over to the forecast, which was happily quite a lot closer. So let's jump back a little bit, and from just a high level, can you walk through the overall architecture of how this model works?
Yeah. So basically, what this model does is it's a polls-based model. I still kind of think that polls are the most reliable way to figure out the results of the election. We can talk about alternative methods later, but we kind of went with the polls. We took every single poll that came in, except the polls that, as long as a poll surveyed all Georgia voters, we included it. And we kept track of what they said about the race and how many undecided voters there were. And then we just tried to average all the polls. And then there's a lot more to the forecast than that. And that's what I'll get into next is...
And sorry, just to interrupt, but we didn't just do a simple average, right? We did take some grading of the pollsters into account.
Yeah, so that's what I'll get into next is it's not a simple average. First, the polls are adjusted, and then they are weighted, and then there are non-poll factors we consider. So the adjusting of the polls is like some polls just generally, because of their methodological choices, like how they're using those toggles we talked about, they end up systematically finding better findings for Democrats or Republicans. So you may know pollsters like Rasmussen and Trafalgar tend to be very Republican-leaning, whereas other pollsters tend to be very liberal-leaning. So we went back and we looked at, did they poll the 2020 general election? And if so, how much were they off by? And then we just adjusted their poll, if they were 3 points more Democratic leaning, we reduced their number by 3 points, and to get a new adjusted number. And then we also weighted polls where if a poll was more recent, we gave it more weight. If it sampled more people, we gave it more weight. And then we also looked at the historical accuracy of the polls going all the way back to 2000, and gave more weight to polls that were historically more accurate. And we tried to more heavily weight the more recent elections, but also include all the elections going back to 2000, which is the data we had on poll quality. And then some pollsters poll the race multiple times. We try to discount that so that no one pollster is kind of dominating our average. And when we add that all up, we had a polling average of both races at Warnock plus 1.8 and Ossoff plus 1.8. So our polling average was actually pretty much spot on. It were some of the other adjustments that I thought were very reasonable where our model may have trailed off a little bit. But that's kind of how we were weighting and adjusting the polls. So that's the polls part of our model. To get into some of the other things we considered were that, so we actually just had a general election where Ossoff and Warnock ran, and they did not, Purdue beat Ossoff by 1.8 points in the general election. And we tried to take that into account as basically having this general election being like a very sophisticated poll with 4 million people, very large sample size. And we tried to give that a lot of weight in our model as well. And so that was basically saying, sure, the polls have Ossoff and Warnock up by 2 points, but in the general election, they also had Ossoff and Warnock up by 2 points, and they ended up losing. So let's adjust our polling average back down to reality. And we don't really believe this +2 number this time. And so that's why our model was kind of pointing things a bit lower, was using that historical data. It just happened that this time the polls actually were pretty much spot on. But when was the last time the polls were spot on? We were kind of betting on the polls not being spot on, and that ended up just not being a good bet this time around. But if you had taken this polling average to the bank in the general election, you would have been sorely disappointed when the Republicans win by 2 more points than you're expecting.
That's right. And let me just recap for folks what the sort of base case, again, just like with the Poll Explorer, all the different assumptions and weights in the model you can, through the website, play with. We put some kind of user-friendly toggles and sliders and checkboxes up front. You can also then click through and get to the actual raw numbers in the model itself. And there you can change absolutely everything. But we kind of tried to make the primary factors really kind of easily adjustable up front. But if you went with our just total defaults, again, we had an absolute dead even 50-50 split between Ossoff and Purdue. And for Warnock, we had him, 56% likely to win.
Right.
And I think, so obviously the forecasted margin was 0.0% on Ossoff. And I think we had a 0.5% win for Warnock. So it wound up being off by 1% in the case of Ossoff, and 1.5% maybe, depending where it shakes out on Warnock. But here too, just the same way that we looked at the Poll Explorer and what we could have done differently that would have suggested a closer forecast of the actual result. Curious to hear your thoughts on what we might have done differently on the forecast. One of the ones that I had noticed, and this relates to one of the things I was mentioning on the poll, where you saw that late breaking 1 to 2 points towards the Democrats in just the last few days. We have one of these toggles is how the undecideds break. And you can either say they break evenly or for the Democrats or for the Republicans. The default was break evenly. If you simply switch it to they break for the Democrats, you move, I've forgotten the exact percentage, but they go up, I think, 5 to 10 percentage points in terms of their likelihood to win. And I think better part of 1%, 1 percentage point on their margin, which is to say you get actually most of the way from our error, our forecast error, which was not huge to begin with, but you close most of the gap between that. You actually get very close to the actual forecasted margin. So I'm wondering if, again, with the whole exercise being how do we apply these lessons to the next go round here, if we see in a future race a sudden break towards one party or another in the polling averages pretty consistently across the board, moving 1 or 2 points, if we should then say, okay, sure, right up till election eve, you've got polls coming out that, very fresh polls, but the polls are still obviously rear looking, right? It takes a couple days to publish them, and they might have a few day long survey period. So I wonder if in a case where you see a polling average that shifts in those last couple of days, if it makes sense to then say, okay, but you now probably also have an unpolled additional move, that simply can't be captured because you can't just poll everyone the morning of the vote. So to compensate for the kind of unpolled, additional momentum, if simply, matching how the undecideds break to the late breaking polling shift would be, a decent best practice to consider, as kind of a generally applicable tweak. It would work in this case, but again, the goal here is to not overfit, not overlearn the lessons of the last battle.
Yeah.
But is that a plausible thing to consider as a, something that we layer into the forecast going forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. And as you said, it definitely would have worked here, but definitely need to consider a larger sample size. So like when I looked at a bunch of polls from like 2000 to 2020, there's really just not much historical evidence for quote unquote momentum. It's hard to use polling movement in one time period to predict polling movement in another time period. But I haven't actually really looked at like the momentum of the final week. I guess like I'm talking about, does the momentum in month 3 predict momentum in month 2? With like month 0 being the election. Yeah.
Right. No, and I can see that too, where like momentum, general opinions shifting in one way or another, that might be harder to find, repeating trends in. But here where it's on a very short time frame, where you're simply trying to catch the stump, right, of the unpollable period of the last day or two, even if you got 5 polls on the last day of, and if it was a 3-day survey period that ended the day before the poll was released, you've if you're getting a sharp turn, like if you accept the premise that Hawley and the Trump's call to the Georgia Secretary of State and the $2,000 checks not coming out of Senate caused a late breaking and sharp shift, that simply because of the end of the polling window was not fully captured. Maybe assuming the undecided's breaking one way or another is not the perfectly kind of eloquent way to capture that, but I wonder if some adjustment there is simply saying, look, there is a polling stump there, and usually it's not going to be that you're getting this last few days sudden shift. But in this case, looking back, that might have been something that we should have thought about how to capture.
Yeah, and I guess that would have worked in the 2016 and 2020 general presidential elections too, where both in 2016 and 2020, there was kind of a late shift towards Trump. You definitely saw that with the James Comey letter kind of really killing Hillary Clinton in the last week, where there was like, I think a 2 or 3 point sudden shift against Hillary. Continuing that momentum would have really helped you see Trump's victory. But yeah, it's hard to say whether that would have worked in all sorts of elections. Yeah, we're really trying to not just, as you say, not just forecast 1, 2, or 3 elections, but forecast all elections. So we just need to kind of grab that data set and see whether and how much it works.
That makes sense. What else in terms of these sort of other reasonable assumptions that we may have been contemplating but didn't use going in, or with the benefit of hindsight, you can look at anything else here in terms of tweaks to our assumptions and weights here that might have made a still defensible and yet somewhat closer to the actual result kind of forecast?
I guess like it might be good for us to reconsider just like how much weight are we giving to polls versus other non-polling factors. And also, I guess one interesting thing was we were seeing historically Republican-leaning pollsters still put out favorable wins for the Democrats. I think that should have been maybe a bigger sign for us to see that if even the Republican pollsters think the Democrats are going to win, maybe we should give that a bit more credence, because that like never really happens.
Right.
Even when Democrats win, Republican pollsters say Republicans will win. And even when Republicans win, Democratic pollsters say Democrats will win. So maybe we should look a bit more on whether there's any polling firms crossing sides. I think another thing that we haven't really talked about that could be a whole podcast is the early voting data. We had like a 2 weeks of early voting data up to the election that like showed really good results for Democrats, and other people's forecasts out there kind of made pretty heavy use or in 100% use of this early voting data, and we had pretty much no weight on that because it's honestly just for stupid reasons. It's not something I really know that much about, and I wasn't really comfortable forecasting things with things I don't understand.
Yeah, no, we were definitely keeping an eye on those kind of models. We didn't really have the bandwidth to roll that into this Georgia model, and we wish we could have. And yeah, as you mentioned, some of the other polls made heavy or even exclusive use of it. One of them, a notable one from Lakshya Jain and Ali Dinkor, they were doing tremendous work mapping every bit down to the county level, if not the precinct level, on this early voting data, and they came out with a forecast that was. I think they had Democrats winning by about 5 points. Or actually, I think they only ran the Ossoff Purdue in terms of actually forecasting a margin. So they overestimated a bit based on that. But I think especially in an era where the early and mail ballots are so significant and so unprecedented, we don't really have, at least in most states, a history of significant, or in some cases majority, of votes coming in that way, that getting a handle on that for all pollsters, all forecasters, I think is going to be really critical to being able to predict races reliably going forward. One other of the non-polling factors that we did include in our forecast was, of course, the prediction market data, specifically from the website Predict It, where those of you who know me know that I used to do work curating the markets at Predict It, which is a real money political prediction market. Go check them out at predictit.org if you haven't tried it out yet. It's a lot of fun, a lot of interesting impeachment markets and other end of Trump administration things to trade up there right now. But we included the daily prediction market data on those two Georgia Senate runoff races as part of our model. And it was one of the things that if you jump back into the model, you can choose whether or not to include it. And interestingly, we were in the day or two after the Georgia election, looking at some of the other forecasters who were brave enough to put out forecasts. One of them that did exceptionally well, perfectly, basically, was Thomas Miller. If you're familiar with him, Peter, at Northwestern, professor at Northwestern. His model, I think, exclusively or almost exclusively uses prediction market data. And he, in the 2020 general, was going by all the state level, prices and building out. He did a little bit more, I think, kind of post-processing and modeling of the data itself. But to come up with his forecast, and he was doing actually hourly updates, which was really cool, through his Twitter account. And we'll put it in the show notes. I don't have it right in front of me what Thomas Miller's Twitter handle is, but we'll put it there so you can check him out. So he was doing these hourly updates, and I think his final forecast in Georgia was Ossoff by 1 and Warnock by 2. And in the end, not all the votes are counted, but I think the New York Times Needle estimate still has Ossoff by 1 or 1.1 and Warnock by 2. So he basically got it exactly right, or within like 0 to 0.1% on both, which is interesting because our whole idea here of let's bring crowd wisdom to traditional election forecasting. He doesn't use polls at all, as far as I'm aware. He goes simply for the market data, and may throw some of his own secret sauce on top, but. Maybe it's a lesson here that, and I know you're a big believer in the polls, and I don't discount them either. I think they need to be heavily weighted and adjusted, as do you, and that's a big part of what our model does. But Miller's success in 2020, and certainly here in January 2021, is really notable. I really tip my hat to him, and I think we ought to spend some time really digging into to his methodology, because it's not to say it would always work, but he certainly came out smelling better than anyone else. On this time around. I mean, I look at, and we were trying to compile, again, there weren't that many that actually put out probabilistic forecasts or margin forecasts, but you had Miller, who was basically exact. You had the Jain Dinkor, who were off by, I guess, about 4 points. We were off by about 1 to 1.5 points. Real Clear Politics, their simple average was off by about 0.5 point. 538 didn't put out a forecast, but their adjusted poll forecast was off by about 2 points. So no one, whether modeling or simply poll aggregating did as well as Miller. So I want to spend some more time looking at his stuff, and hopefully we can even get him on the podcast to hear about his process a little bit.
That would be really great. Yeah, I mean, I think anyone who just kind of averaged and adjusted and weighted the polls got like a really nice result. I think it was like a lot of this like assuming polling errors would repeat kind of stuff that steered us wrong this time, but would have really helped in the general election. Yeah, I'll definitely need to learn more about Thomas Miller's methods. I did also want to say something really quick about the early vote data. Is like, I think that's going to be a really cool thing to use going forward, but I wonder kind of once COVID's gone and like there aren't people mass mail-in balloting anymore, and whether that's still going to work. And then also, I think it's like Georgia, North Carolina, and Florida are like the 3 states that give us this like really rich early vote data, but that a lot of states kind of aren't giving us the data that we need. And maybe that'll change going forward, but it might be very difficult to like predict the results of Michigan based on early vote data. So I guess we'll still just kind of need to keep adjusting our methodologies.
It might even get trickier because some states obviously already had some manner of mail-in voting or kind of universal absentee, no excuse absentee kind of voting pre-COVID. But I wonder if even post-COVID, we're going to have some of these states that have adopted these new measures not going back, still saying, okay, well, we're not going to take that away from you now. Sure, you can still have no excuse early absentee voting, or we'll continue with early voting. And yet, so you may still have a really significant percentage coming early and by mail, and yet you may still have no comparator, right? Because the 2020 election, there was such a huge disparity between the turnout, the partisan turnout early in mail versus day of. Obviously, much, very Democrat skewing in the early mail and very Republican skewing in the day of. But 2 years from now, 4 years from now, you're not going to have Trump on the ballot, or you might not. He might, I guess, but it's not going to be. It's not going to be the 2020 election where a lot of that was driven by the disparate messaging from the Biden team, the Democrats versus the Trump team, and the Republicans, and just plausibly different behavioral responses to that, and different responses to COVID, and safety concerns in terms of how people were gonna vote, and so. If we do have a really significant portion of early and mail balloting in various states going forward, relying too heavily on how it shook out in 2020 could be a fatal flaw, right? Because you might not have such a wide disparity if you don't have one team saying vote on election day in person, the other team saying vote early and by mail. So yeah, that's going to be a tricky one for everyone, I think, in 22 and 2024.
Yeah, I think like a lot of the early vote tracking kind of does depend a bit on assumptions that I was a little worried about. Like, I think one thing we saw in our polling were that like Republicans were mass shifting toward voting on election day. And so I thought that maybe the early vote was favoring Democrats because the Republicans were just waiting to election day to vote, like more so than in the general election. And I think that was the case somewhat, but like our kind of polling definitely led me to like greatly overstate that. So I guess that ended up being a bit of a statistical mirage, but that was part of the reason why I was like a little skeptical of the early vote data.
Yeah, it's hard to know. That's why this is a tough business.
Yeah,
it's one that it's important to get right because not only these polls but these forecasts, they impact what people expect from election day, and they can lead to people being quite surprised, as they were in 2016, as they nearly were in 2020 in a lot of interesting races. They were surprised in a lot of the House races and things like that. And so I think it's an area that it needs to improve, and we're hopeful we can contribute to that in some small way, both in terms of the polling and the forecasting that relies on that polling. I think people have justifiably lost a lot of faith in that process that traditionally has been decent, I think, in terms of capturing public opinion, but various shifts, obviously huge shifts this year, and lots of anomalies and one-offs and things that won't repeat. But even 4 years ago, 8 years ago, it was shift away from landlines and shifting demographics and things like that. It's hard to adapt these sort of very long-held procedures and best practices that have always worked, and suddenly don't seem to work so well. But it's important it's important to get right, and we're hoping that we can contribute to that improvement. We invite all of you listeners to help us in that process. Of course, in addition to our website, openmodelproject.org. In fact, that's really the only URL you need to remember, because we invite you to come follow us on Twitter, which you can access through that website. You can join our Discord server and actually join our conversation, help us with this process, get involved in the refinement and evolution of these polling and forecasting methods through that Discord server, sort of our main communication hubs. You can access the invitation link to that through our website. If you want to go straight to our Twitter, our handle is openmodelproj, P-R-O-J, do the character limits. Peter, let's talk a little bit before we close about where we're going next. There are, of course, no federal elections other than the specials due to House and possibly Senate vacancies later this year. But there are a lot of interesting races, and we've started to sort of mull over a few of them. And one of them is actually not exactly a race, but it will be a ballot contest. And that's the possible recall vote of California Governor Gavin Newsom. There is a recall petition underway now. And actually, speaking of predicted, there is a market there on whether that petition will gather the, correct me, Peter, if I'm wrong, is it 1.5 million signatures they need to make it on the ballot?
The 1.5 million is the threshold, but we know historically a lot of signatures get rejected. So I think they really need more like 1.8 million signatures to kind of get enough buffer to handle all the rejected signatures. I'm not making any betting moves, but I think that they will be successful.
It's starting to look that way. I mean, just again, if you go by the prediction market odds, just a few days ago, this was kind of in like the 40% range, trading about 40 cents on the dollar. It's rocketed just in the last couple of days up to, it's currently 66%. So traders are saying there's a 2/3 chance that this recall election does move forward. With, of course, shades of Gray Davis and Arnold Schwarzenegger on everyone's mind. So this would be a really fascinating one. I know, Peter, you've done some polling in California before and actually been quite successful with it. So I think this would be great, not, to say nothing for whatever the electoral or policymaking implications of a possible recall would be. But should it happen, should the recall election go forward, I think it would be a really appropriate next test case for this, something for us to work towards in the coming months. So we will see come mid-March if that petition is successful. We've also, of course, got a little later this year in June, we have a hotly contested New York City Democratic mayoral primary. There will be a couple of gubernatorial primaries also in the summer or fall. I've forgotten the exact dates, but for New Jersey and Virginia, and of course, the Virginia House of Delegates will be an interesting series of races in the fall. So there's a lot. There's a lot on the horizon. There's a lot for us to sink our teeth into over the course of this year. We want all of you to help us out. Peter is doing fantastic work, as are the other members of the core team that have been working so diligently with us on this, largely behind the scenes and on our Twitter feeds and the like. And please do check out our team page at openmodelproject.org to check out their bios and their social media accounts. They're very much worth a follow, and really appreciate all the hard work they've been doing, not only on the modeling and the polling analysis, but building the website and all this functionality and helping with the the PR and community building. It's Peter, you and the rest of the team have done just such a tremendous job in helping us to bring this to fruition in such a short period of time. It's terrific. I'm just so glad to be working with all of you on it.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I remember this project started less than a month ago, so it's
it's incredible.
Tremendous.
It's been a long
what
month.
we've it's pretty tremendous what we stood up.
Yeah.
And, I mean, making the polls and the forecasts at a record pace might be part of the reason why we weren't as accurate as maybe we would have liked. So hopefully once we have, I mean, again, not trying to excuse our performance, but hopefully when we have a bit more time too, we might find a little bit more accuracy. But these things are just pretty challenging. And I mean, when you say 50% odds, like really anything can happen anyway. So
that's right. And you say 50% odds on a binary event, you're going to be right and you're going to be wrong, right? If the thing you think is slightly more likely to happen happens, great, you look like a genius, and if it doesn't, you look like a dolt. And yet, really, you can't make much of a meaningful judgment about a 50% forecast in isolation. You got to look over time. But, and going into, we sort of laughed about this right before the final forecast came out, was that we were hoping to, while a lot of other forecasters were saying, Georgia, they're 50, it's a toss-up, it's a coin flip. We don't know, so we're not going to forecast it. We said, no, F that. We're gonna actually dig into this data and come up with a bold forecast. And in the end, we came up at least on OSOP's sake to 50.0%. But again, you go where the data says you go. But we'll see how that goes forward. And I take your point too, in that we were trying to push out. We were going for a heavy lift here in the amount of time from when we started this a month ago to getting something with in-house polling and a fully fledged model and the public-facing user interactivity and everything else in less than a month. Really, I think just 3 weeks before the election was tremendous, and I'm so gratified that you all were able to put it together. And again, as I mentioned up top, the idea was not that we'd have something that would be perfect. That's sort of the idea. We want it out there, warts and all. We want you to see what we're doing. We kind of have this like the open kitchen in the middle of the restaurant, so see how we're doing this process. So you can tell us what we're doing wrong, and we can figure out together what we're doing wrong, and collectively figure out what's the right way to do it, and build as robust and transparent and accountable framework going forward as possible. That's the whole idea.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm excited. Yeah, I took a look at my general election model and my House and Senate models, and I added it up, and it does seem actually, when I say something's 80% likely to happen, it happens 78% of the time. So that's
so you're good. Overconfident, Peter.
I'm slightly overconfident, but that's pretty good.
That's pretty good. That's very well calibrated.
So, and like when I say something happens 50% of the time, it does tend to happen 50% of the time. So I guess like definitely a lot to learn, but also don't want to overgeneralize from just 2 Senate races. And I look forward to seeing what we can do in the future.
Absolutely. Can't wait. Thank you all so much for joining us. Peter, thank you for being with us today. Thanks for all your time. If you in the audience have questions for an upcoming episode, please come to openmodelproject.org. There's a contact page where you can get in touch with us. Again, we want you to follow us on Twitter, openmodelproj. Join that Discord server. There's a link to it on the website. Join the conversation. Help us build out these forecasts going forward. Thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you next time.